Hello, this is another wonderful moment on our favorite program, the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, that is brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. I want to say Happy New Year, everyone. I'm excited to be here once again, and I wanted to let you know that we had a very wonderful virtual conference January 7th and 8th. And prior to that conference, I had to take a pause to ensure that we gave the conference a good packaging. And from the participants of the conference, the Indigenous Hands and Voices of African Identity, the first of its kind. People have appraised the conference as being a successful one, and I agree with all the opinions of the participants because from every indication, we were able to have a wonderful conference. We had very powerful presentations from very powerful scholars. We had less of technical hitches. We had a good attendance from across the world, from across Africa, the UK, the United States, and Canada. And it was awesome. It was really awesome. The discussions from that conference, I'm going to be recapping in this program going forward. But before then, I want to use today to round off on the topic I was discussing before the conference came, which was the case against deaf education in Africa, Nigeria as a focus. Remember, I was going around the African countries talking about deaf education, the impact vis-a-vis the impact of the foreign-based sign language that deaf education introduced into schools for the deaf in various African countries. So that is still the topic I'm going to be sharing with you today. Then after that, I'm going to delve into the topic of recapping the presentations that are featured in that conference, the Indigenous Hands and Voices of African Identity. And I'm sure that you've missed this program and that you are longing to plug in again with the discussions that we have here every week. Of course, I am too. But before I go ahead, I want to announce to you that on our Facebook page, the advocates for the Indigenous African Sign Languages, we are starting a quiz session that is starting on the first day of February up to the end of the month. That is to say that the quiz is going to be running once a month. And that quiz session, there's going to be cash prizes to win. So it is not going to be like a very childish, quiz activity. The questions are going to be coming from the videos that we have recorded here in the past and the ones we're going to record going forward. One of our team members that is going to be anchoring that program, Olamide Fatosin, is going to be giving us briefings about how the program is going to go. And I invite you to please participate in that quiz session. And the reason for that is because we want to heighten the discussions we have about Indigenous sign languages in Africa, because it is high time that we continue to have these discussions in the open, just like the participants of the conference suggested. A lot of the participants of the conference hadn't been in such a conversation where Indigenous African sign languages were discussed, but it was a very wonderful experience for a lot of people. So this is the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices, brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. We are about to kick off for today's topic. Okay, going back to the discussion I was having before the break we had in this festive time, I was trying to bring us to the light of what goes on in our schools for the deaf. Not just about the social relationship or maybe what they teach or do not teach deaf children, but about the importance of the significance of deaf education in our African countries and its impact in the sign language in use. You are very much aware, if not by any other means, at least by virtue of these conversations we have here, that the sign languages that are used in schools for the deaf in some African countries today, using Nigeria as a case study, are regarded to as, by some people, American Sign Language. Some say, oh, it is not American Sign Language, but it is a variety of American Sign Language. And I have always informed us that even scholars have, described the sign language variety as a dialect of American Sign Language. But in our own studies, we've been able to describe it as the school sign language. And that is because we want to separate that variety of sign language from the varieties that we see in the indigenous deaf communities, so that to disambiguate what originated from American Sign Language or what was brought into the country by Dr. Andrew Foster. So this is an issue we are looking at, which is important to this topic. But in this series that I started in the last year, I was also looking at what deaf education means in the countries. And I looked at Gabon, and I looked a little bit at Ghana, and then came into Nigeria. And I'm also hoping to look at a few other countries as we go forward. And I started reading for you from the manuscript that was prepared by the Federal Ministry of Education, Nigeria. And that same document is what I'm reading from today. As a continuation of my last topic, if you go to our channel to look at the videos that I presented in the past by discussion on this topic, you will recall that the Federal Minister of Education presented her manuscript about special needs education, not deaf education. So in that line of the excerpts I read from the document, I want to continue by reading this. It says, there was no functional legislation on special needs education. The kind of laws that existed then were mainly that of grants in aid. Grants in aid. So I'm looking at absence of legislation in the schools for the deaf, but what the manuscript calls it is special needs education. And it says some of the laws in some states are now moribund. This is a statement from the manuscript prepared by the Federal Ministry of Education. It continues, a terminology being used generally for persons with disability is physically challenged. There is no such terminology in special needs education like physically challenged. This is the manuscript. And it says, the term physically challenged describes only a limited portion of persons with special needs, in bracket PSN. It has been wrongly used to mean persons with special needs. And I continue. Bias, cultural archetypes, and negative behavior patterns about special needs education are endemic in Nigeria. This is the federal government, the Federal Ministry of Education's document, prepared in 2015. positive re-attitudinization and rebranding for both the service givers and the end users should form the basis of the new policy. This document is proposing for a new policy that is going to call upon the change of attitude of people that are working in this sector. That is what it's calling them. It is prescribing and recommending for change of attitude by people who are in charge of people with special needs. And when I say that, I mean deaf people. And going particularly to the point, I mean deaf children, those that are in school. The source or scope of funding special needs education should be clearly defined. That means, was it not defined before? Who knows? Even where funding is available, it is sometimes accessed by unqualified professionals of non-existent organizations in the social services sector, or diverted because special needs education services are seen as secondary humanitarian services. This is one of the areas that I can't but laugh. Is it even where funding is available, that it is sometimes accessed by unqualified professionals of non-existent organizations? Where are they coming from? I mean, come to think of it, this is government's manuscripts. Who are those unqualified professionals? Who are those non-existent organizations? And what business do they have in the government business for people with special needs, for deaf children, for deaf education? What business? And it says that such funding are being diverted. Because what? Because special needs education, because deaf education is seen as a secondary humanitarian service. Is it how it's supposed to be seen? Well, that is not our writing. In Nigeria, accurate data on the incidence and prevalence of persons with special needs are not available for service delivery from centers. This is one of the very experiences we had when we started our work in the schools for the deaf. One of the things we used to do was, any school that wanted to have an outreach in, we would request their documentation. We would ask them, okay, we want to see the population of the students, the population of the boys, the girls, and we want to know some additional demography of the students. But in most cases, we hardly got any. In some cases, we got some fractured ones. And that was an evidence that there is hardly a good documentation. And this is a set of people working with people that have special needs, quote and unquote, that are supposed to be well documented, both for current, for present, and future purposes. But such documentation, the Federal Ministry of Education is saying that they are hardly around. You can easily find them when you want one or when you need one. He says it will be difficult to plan without relevant data. That's what we keep saying. Why can't we have data? Why can't we have the demography of these people that we want to one way or the other render services for? You cannot in any way serve a people better without knowing their demography, without seeing the data that will support the services you want to render. He said data collecting system center for persons with special needs are inadequate or non-existent. Well, I don't know. It's not as if it is strangely a situation that happens for people with special needs, deaf people inclusive, so long as they're in school. We know that we do not have that culture, but it is very terrible that the way this manuscript describes this in line with the set of people that we are referring to here. It is very disheartening. And it says finally that the various sectors of special needs education are not manned by special needs education professionals. When it is not manned and the federal government is the one that is in charge of employing those that should man those sectors, but they're not manned by them, so they're manned by people that are unqualified. That means it is not out of place when we reported that when we get to schools, you will hardly see people that are trained to teach deaf students. You will see some other people that are not trained for that. They are working there. And also, more terrible is that you will hardly see deaf persons teaching deaf students. In any school, you will see more of hearing people and less of deaf teachers. I can remember in one of the schools that have about 20 teachers, 14 were hearing and 6 were deaf. Oh wow, that was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. When we now went to other schools whereby you will just see one deaf person. Then you see the other persons, maybe about 3 deaf, 3 teachers that can sign, and the rest are non-signing teachers that are hearing, that are teaching these deaf children. And the impact of this topic is, what is the significance of deaf education that came into the African continent? And by virtue of that, displaced the indigenous sign languages that were in use, that were not for deaf education. Till today, we are aware that deaf people are becoming educated and they are graduates. But let's get into these schools where deaf people are trained and have a second look at what is going on. And when we look at what is going on and try to relate it to this document that the federal government wrote, a lot of questions will be asked. But for us, our concern is, how has deaf education fared as opposed to how the indigenous sign languages have fared under deaf education? Because people make arguments that yes, deaf people should be educated. They shouldn't have been in darkness forever. And because the sign language in use is sign language in education, and let's just keep the indigenous and make do with the sign language in education. And the question is, the deaf education that displays the indigenous sign languages, has it fared well? How much has it really fared? That is our question in this series. And we are making a case against deaf education. And we are saying it has not fared well. And if something could be done, we still stand by recommending that indigenous sign languages should not be eroded, should not be taken off of the education of deaf people. Part of the problems that we are having in the education of deaf people, go back and forth it, bring it back to the center. As a linguist, I am going to authoritatively tell you it has everything to do with the language of instruction. The terrible confusion that people that are supposed to teach the deaf people are having when they are not people trained in that area, and a lot of them that we have met are not signing teachers, yet they are there. Yet there is sign language, let me say, in every environment. And they are teaching a set of people who, many of them, didn't have access to early sign language. Many of them didn't start school on time, and it is more difficult to teach such set of people, especially when a good number of teachers were not trained, or even if they are trained generally as teachers, were not specially trained for that job they are doing. And then you go up in the cadre, in the government offices, the people that are supposed to be in charge of legislation for the deaf education and education for other people with special needs. The manuscript is saying that a good number of them are not professionals in that area. We are recommending a change of attitude, and it begins with recognizing the language that the deaf community uses and making this language available for deaf children as early as possible, even before they get to school. A good amount of deaf literacy will form a standard for education so that lesser number of deaf students in school will struggle to be taught. And the teachers and those working with the deaf children in school will be re-educated. They will relearn the language and the culture of deaf community, and so that there is going to be a better deaf education. So today, we are going to suspend the topic of case against deaf education in Africa and resume the discussion on the presentations we had in our conference, the Indigenous Hands and Voices of African Identity. And if perchance, according to the program of this series, we might come back to this topic visiting other countries. Until then, I would like to encourage you, please share our videos, like our videos, and subscribe to our channel if you have not done so. This is the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices. And I'm going to see you next week because work has started.